often forgotten by the Final Fantasy fandom at large in favour of much bigger, bolder releases such as Final Fantasy 6, 7, 9, 10, 14. Final Fantasy 3 set up a lot of the foundations that are prevalent in the franchise, like the job system, recruitable summon bosses, and a final boss that seemingly turns up out of nowhere. But how well has the game aged in today's era and so many years later after its original release? And is it worth your time amongst the crazy backlogs we all have ready for the coming year? In a sea of live service titles that constantly beg for your attention and your time and your money, and sprawling modern games that boast hundreds of hours of gameplay, is there still a place in your library for a game like Final Fantasy 3? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. Hello there beautiful, my name is Joesephyr and welcome to a new series of videos that I'm going to be making with regards to not only the Final Fantasy series but other games as well, called Should You Play, which is very much a case of looking at some of these older games, seeing how well they've aged, as well as looking at some newer titles and honestly sort of reviewing them, but with a keen eye on some aspects of games that maybe other reviews don't look at, such as community aspects, how active the game is, whether you can fit the time in to play a game like this when you have so many other things going on. That's all stuff that we want to be looking at, and we're going to be starting by looking at Final Fantasy 3. So if you'd like to come along and join in with all the fun that comes with all of that stuff, then perhaps you'd like to consider subscribing to the channel, and you can also find me over on Twitch, Twitter and Discord and Patreon if you'd like to follow the links in the description box below. With Patreon, I do always shout out one of my patrons every time I release a brand new video, and in today's video we're going to be shouting out Treevoid, who he himself is a massive fan of Final Fantasy 3, and we had some wonderful discussions about the game, so thank you very much for that. I am looking at including my Patreon polls and stuff like that within videos like this to get everyone else's opinions on some of these games, so if you'd like to join in with that, as well as a plethora of other benefits, perhaps you'd like to consider clicking on the link in the description box below and supporting the channel further. Now, Final Fantasy 3, certainly in its original form on the NES and its Pixel Remaster, feels to me the most like a traditional RPG, arguably across the entire series, with 4 unnamed protagonists questing to restore balance between light and dark to the world. It's definitely got a more simplistic story than a lot of the later games, but it's also a major departure from the controversial Final Fantasy 2, which we'll be covering in a later video, and bringing back the simplicity of the first game but with additional elements. There are more story elements to this than the first game had, but I do think that the second game actually has one up on this one when it comes to that particular element. Now, Final Fantasy 3 I think is great for people who want to see where the mainstays of the franchise came from. So if you've played other Final Fantasies, I think this is a great place to kind of go back and go, oh, so that's where this came from. That's where the Fat Chocobo came from. That's how a lot of these things happened and where the job system came from, and seeing it in its purest form, but it's definitely not one I would recommend as a first Final Fantasy. So if you've never played a Final Fantasy before, stay tuned because we'll be covering other Final Fantasies like in future videos where I think that they might be better for you. I do also think that it's one of the least published Final Fantasy titles today, not seeing re-releases after its initial release in 1990 on the NES, all the way until 2006 when it was re-released on the DS, and then now we have the Pixel Remaster, which has been released in the last couple of years, which is the version of the game that we'll be focusing on most prevalently in this video. Now, I've played Final Fantasy 3 a few times, and in my most recent playthrough, I played through the entire game quite comfortably in well under 10 hours, and that was with me taking breaks to go and make tea, chat to friends, etc., and I was playing it in the background, so it's certainly not a long game by any means, but the simplicity of the game was very refreshing, and with the story being as simple comparatively to other games in the franchise, while I appreciate the fact that the focus is more heavily on sort of the gameplay, it being a 1990 release, games were a lot more simple and didn't have these massive, sprawling, heavy story experiences that they do today. So players looking for that may want to look at later entries in the series, but those that want to just kind of boil everything down to basics, like I said earlier, might actually find a lot to love in Final Fantasy 3. Now, the job system doesn't have a huge amount of depth to it by any means, certainly not compared with later games, even like Final Fantasy 5, Final Fantasy 12, and certainly not Final Fantasy 14. And honestly, you probably find you won't use 75% of them in a regular playthrough, because the likes of Monk, Black Mage, White Mage, they're all so strong that you'd only realistically want to replace them with their upgraded versions like Black Belt and Scholar later down the line. And the jobs also don't carry over abilities to one another like they do in Final Fantasy V, and they only tend to carry one ability, so that's something to keep in mind. There are specific points in the story where certain jobs, there is a particular boss that's very weak to Dragoon, but you probably won't use Dragoon very often outside of that unless you really want to use that particular job. One thing I was quite surprised at how much I enjoyed with Final Fantasy III, certainly with the 2D version rather than the 3D one, is that the flow of the game is surprisingly well paced for today's standards, with major beats of the game never fully outstaying their welcome, acquisition of new jobs, new airships, new weapons flows well. It's not like Final Fantasy I where unless you're equipped with a sword, you ain't seeing another weapon of your type for a long time. And there are guest characters that pop up, and in the 3D version of the game, they actually participate in battle as well. They don't in the 2D version, but that's something to bear in mind with differences between the two versions. And that breaks up the story beats as well quite nicely. It allows you to kind of get to know characters like Desh and Arya within the context of the story, and it just flows really nicely. But, as I said earlier, it's a 1990 game. Don't expect these huge, major plot twists, deep character developments. I mean, in the original versions of the game, the four warriors are unnamed, which is why I feel like it's more like a traditional RPG than other Final Fantasy games, because you're supposed to project yourself onto these characters. But then you have the 3D version, which was remade later, where the characters were renamed to Luneth, Ingus, Ark, and Refia. I had to remember Ark's name for a moment there. And there's a bit more sort of depth to the characters there, but they're still very simplistic, which is why I feel that the story in Final Fantasy II actually has a leg up here. Like, the characters are more well developed, the villains are more sort of clear, you do have a little bit of a twist and turn with the likes of Leon. Final Fantasy III doesn't have that quite so much. There are select points in Final Fantasy III when it comes to pacing, however, where you're expected to push through large swaths of enemies with nary a save point to be seen. Now, the end of the game in particular is very guilty of this. By and large, though, it's actually a really easy game to just pick up and play. But I don't know about you, but certainly as somebody who has a lot of JRPGs and the like in their backlog, if I don't play an RPG for a while, I'll pick it back up again and I'll have forgotten where I'm supposed to go, and then I struggle to get back on track. And it being an older game, these older games definitely don't have like waypoints, markers, things like that to tell you where to go like they do now, so do keep that in mind when you go to play Final Fantasy III. Now, there are multiple versions of Final Fantasy III, from the original NES version, to the 3D version on the DS and Steam, to the Pixel Remaster that was released last year. Now, in today's video, we've primarily covered the Pixel Remaster most predominantly, but the 3D version in particular is worth mentioning as it's definitely not worse or better than the 2D version. I would say it was different. And what I will say, though, is that it is more challenging than the 2D version. I played through the 2D version pretty quickly. The 3D version definitely gave me quite a lot of roadblocks, certainly at the beginning of the game, where you had to grind a little bit more heavily, and I feel that that's down to just the balancing of stat distribution within the 3D version as compared to the 2D version, and therefore I found it dramatically harder. And I died a lot in that version, and I didn't die once in the 2D one. So alongside the story adjustments, such as the characters being named and fleshed out a little more in the 3D version, and those guest characters actually participating in battle, there is food for thought as to which version you might want to play. I personally prefer the 2D version, but being honest, they're not expensive games, it's not a long game, so why not try both if you enjoy one of them? I do always want to talk about music in the older Final Fantasy games, because I think that the music and the presentation of Final Fantasy is a huge proportion of why it's so relevant in today's era of gaming, even dating as far back as the 80s and 90s. And it does deserve a mention for Final Fantasy III here, because there are many tracks that have been used in other methods, such as the game's main theme, Eternal Wind, which is stunning, and I love it, by the way, isn't actually known for FF3 as much anymore, because it's now pretty much just known as Grahatia's theme in Final Fantasy XIV. But it's a standout for a reason. It's a beautiful piece of music, and not only is Eternal Wind fantastic, but the final battle theme of Cloud of Darkness is really good. You know, that boss that's clearly alluded to throughout the entire game, and definitely doesn't pop up out of nowhere at the end after Xander. But there is also the return of the Final Fantasy main theme, which was audaciously missed from Final Fantasy II, and still makes me cry pretty much every time I hear it. No, we don't need to talk about it. Now, one thing that I do like to talk about when I look at games is how much conversation and community interaction there is behind it, because it's something that I get a lot of joy from when I play a game, is am I going to be able to talk to other people about this? Am I going to be able to share my passion for this game if I really love it? And particularly with an older game like this one. Now, Final Fantasy as a whole, like the whole community for the series, is huge. So any game you play within the franchise is going to be within that umbrella, so you're going to be off to a good start. But if you want to play this particular one, it doesn't have as much of a following as the other games, like on Reddit or YouTube. Discussions on Final Fantasy 3 comparatively to the likes of 6, 7, 10, 14 is going to be a little lower, but there's always options for creating communities within Final Fantasy 3. All of the older Final Fantasies are very, very good for speedrunning communities. If you wanted to take part in speedrunning, there are tons of communities out there for all of the older Final Fantasy games, and Final Fantasy 3 is no exception. You can also do things like challenge runs with Final Fantasy 3, restricting yourself to what jobs that you're allowed to use, only using like items instead of healing from white mages, etc. There's lots of little things that you can do to kind of breathe new life into a game like Final Fantasy 3. But I have titled the video of this video The Forgotten One for a reason, because there's not much in the way of characterization within Final Fantasy 3 or a sprawling story compared to its peers. There are fewer fans of the franchise that would call it their favourite, but they most certainly are out there. You're more likely to find representatives of FF3 and conversations about FF3 through those representatives in other Final Fantasy media, such as the ties it has to Final Fantasy XIV through its music and some of its themes, or the various mobile games you'll randomly find Onion Night in. But hey, there is an opening there for people who want to talk about it, because I've spoken to plenty of Final Fantasy fans and there are definitely fans of 3 out there. So now, of course, we come to the big question of the video. Should you play Final Fantasy 3 in this day and age? Now, I don't want to do a scoring system for this, because I think with older games like this, subjectivity is always going to be paramount, and so I will present this more as a pros and cons kind of situation. Now, I think Final Fantasy 3 is very easy to pick up and play. It has very simple mechanics, it's very well presented, the pacing is really nicely done, and its music and presentation in both its 3D and its 2D outings are actually pretty solid by today's standards. And there's not actually that much grinding needed, at least not in the 2D version. The 3D version I found I needed to do it a lot more. And because it's a shorter Final Fantasy, you're more likely to be able to fit it into this massive backlog that we all have, because I know I'm not alone in having a big old backlog of games. However, I do think the fact that Final Fantasy is primarily known for being a story-driven game, Final Fantasy III's story is lacking in depth for players who want that particular aspect from their FF titles. There are elements to it. There's not a huge amount of side content. Like, you can go and like look for Bahamut, Leviathan, things like that as the game progresses, and obviously you can grind yourself to max level and stuff like that. But by and large, you'll find that you're kind of on the main path for the majority of the time, and the story is very simplistic because, again, 1990 title. Balancing of the jobs is a little muddy. Like, there are a lot of jobs like Evoker that you'll just never use because there are just better versions of most of the jobs that you'll come across, and the job system isn't quite as fleshed out as it is in the likes of Final Fantasy V. So players who are looking for like super deep combat system might be disappointed. And across the Final Fantasy franchise, it is one of the quieter games in terms of community engagement. So if you want to create conversation about Final Fantasy III, then you might find you need to start that conversation. But there are conversations there to be had, and there's plenty of people out there who are willing to listen, myself included. So that's all for today's video. Thank you ever so much for joining me, and do let me know in the comments below, or if you'd like to join us on Discord through the link in the description box below. Let us know what you think of Final Fantasy III. Is it your favourite Final Fantasy? Let's create those conversations. Who is your favourite character from Final Fantasy III? What's your favourite job from Final Fantasy III? Your favourite boss fights within the game? All sorts of things like that. There are loads of conversations that are there to be had about this game, and I really enjoy it for sure. Certainly not at the bottom of my list for Final Fantasy titles. I may do a ranking system, but it'll be a personal one because everyone's opinions are different on those kinds of things. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to hear that kind of thing from me, and we can create discussions on that too. Anyways, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell for notifications on any future videos I might be making, and hopefully you guys enjoy this and I'll be making a load more. So thank you very much for watching. It's lovely to see you, beautiful. Have a great day. Take care.